This is chapter 1. I looked at my watch back there in the study, and I about forgot that I was still in there. So blessed in studying this and reading over this. I'm never going to sleep in there if I'm late coming out. It's generally some other reason if I'm ever late coming out. Don't come looking for me, though. I'll come out sooner or later, and if I don't, I guess you'll be blessed out here anyway. But sometimes I forget that I'm supposed to be out here and not in there. And while you're opening up to that, open up to your outline so you can see that we'll be starting something new here this evening. From here on out, for the next few months, we're going to be looking at Genesis chapter 1. We're going to be looking at the different days of creation. Day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6. Day 1, day 4, and day 6 will be the ones we have to spend the most time on, especially days 4 and 6. So you can remember when we get to those particular days, days 4 and 6, we'll have to spend more time there because there's more involved on both of those days. Days 2, 3, and 5 will not have a lot of time on them. And we'll be taking just the account here in Genesis 1, the way it's broken down, to looking at these 6 various days and what took place on each one of these days. Now, obviously, on some occasions, we'll have to go outside of Genesis 1, which we'll be doing a lot of, but we'll have as our basis what's been given us here in Genesis chapter 1. Now, first of all, the first page of your outline, we covered all of this introductory material. Page 2, we start with creation up at the top of the page. Genesis 1. Now, we had to title it creation even though we dealt with evolution now for many, many weeks and months here. But that's what Genesis 1 is about, in other words, it's creation. We dealt with atheistic evolutionism, theistic evolutionism, page 3. Then on page 4, fiat creationism. And you see how we've got it broken down right through under number 3 in your various letters. Day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4. Then over on page 5, day 5, and day 6. Now there are some things on day 6. Of course, all of chapter 2 of Genesis, at least the account there of Adam and Eve, is occurring on day 6. And that's something that we'll have to cover a little bit later. So it won't come right under day 6 whenever we're looking at that in particular. So that's where we're headed, looking at the various days of creation and what's taking place in these various days. Now, many people today, many of our religious schools, believe that the Genesis account, and when I say the Genesis account, I mean the first 12 or the first 11 chapters here of Genesis, that the Genesis account is no more than either Hebrew folklore or Hebrew superstition, one or the other. And you can remember Charles Darwin, the apostate divinity student turned naturalist, said that the account here of the Hebrews was no better than Hindu folklore, Hindu mysticism. And this is what so many of even our higher education religious schools are holding to today. And what so many Christians or people who call themselves Christians are saying, that this is the folklore of the Hebrews, this is myth. Some of them say that it's poetry. We do have one piece of poetry, and that's over in Genesis chapter 4. The end of Genesis 4, we have our first piece of poetry in the Bible, and our only piece in these initial chapters, anyway, that we're going to be studying here in the book of Genesis. But just to state from the outset here, to make certain that you realize Genesis chapter 1 is not poetry. It is strictly narrative. It's giving us a narrative historical account of what took place. Because you see, if it's poetry like Judges chapter 5 is, then there's a lot of it that you simply do not and that you simply cannot interpret literally. There's some things in Judges 5. There's no way you can take Judges 5 literally for everything that's said there, because that's a very ancient piece and a very elevated piece of Hebrew poetry. And that's why it's dangerous And so you might not realize that if you know that there's such thing as poetry in the Bible. And if you're reading a book on the Old Testament and they're not coming right out and saying, now, we don't believe Genesis 1 to 11, but if they say Genesis 1 is a very beautiful poetical piece, then right away you have to watch out for that. Because what they mean by poetical is that you can't take everything there literally. And this is not poetry here. This is a straightforward, strictly given historical narrative account of things that happened, given just the way they happened. Same thing is true with chapter 3. That's another thing that's explained away as poetry, because serpents can't talk. We all know that serpents can't talk. And so it's very easy to say that chapter 3 of Genesis is Hebrew poetry. And all that's meant there is that there was an evil influence somehow in the mind of Eve. And this evil influence somehow was transmitted then over to Adam. And then mankind began to, from that point on, have a tendency, not inherently evil, but they had a tendency to do wrong from here on out. And you've got to watch out for that. Same is true with Noah and the flood there. Now, if that's poetry, then maybe God's just trying to get across the spiritual point on how bad the whole world is and that men all over the place are wicked. Because after all, the Scriptures themselves use the symbol of water to mean people. So water didn't really cover the whole earth. It's speaking of people. That's over in Revelation 17. It's speaking of people being wicked all over the earth. And whether God destroyed them or something's beside the point. But you see, in all three of these cases, Genesis 1, Genesis 3, and Genesis 6 and 7, if you can delegate these to poetry, then you've, of course, destroyed the narrative, literal account of what God has given us here. The rest of what we have in the Bible we're going to see is based upon what we see here in Genesis 1 to 11. Especially the account of creation and the account of the fall of man. Now, the rest of the Bible is built upon the fact that there was a literal Adam and Eve, and that they fell in sin to a literal serpent that was influenced by a literal Satan, or a literal devil. And from that point on out, until this day, and will continue until the end times, man is inherently evil and inherently bad, and it's not simply that he has a tendency to do wrong. Now, in the New Testament, we see 200 times. I want to give you some facts here about what we've got here in Genesis in these first 11 chapters. First of all, in the New Testament, we see 200 times where it either quotes or alludes to Genesis 1 to 50. Secondly, almost half of these, specifically around 80 of these either quotations or allusions, refer to the first 11 chapters of Genesis. Now you see how disproportionate that is. 200 times referring to 50 chapters, and almost half of that number, 80 times, referring to only 1/5 of the account, and that's the first 11 chapters of Genesis. In other words, much more place is given in the New Testament to the first 11 chapters of Genesis as opposed to the following 39 chapters. If you're going to break them down at 10 or 11 apiece, then you're going to end up with a five-fold division or section of the book of Genesis. And if we've already got 80 of the 200 referring to the first 11 chapters, it shows you how important it is or how deceived the New Testament writers were. Thirdly, all of the New Testament writers, all 8 of them, refer at one time or another to Genesis 1 to 11. Fourthly, all New Testament books, with the exception of the ones I'm going to name, contain some type of either direct or indirect reference to Genesis 1 to 11. All except 8 books, which would give us 19 that do. refer back to Genesis 1 to 11. Those books are the following. First of all, Philippians. 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. 2nd Timothy. Titus. Philemon. 2nd and 3rd John. 19 out of the 27 books, which leaves us 8. 19 do refer, and these 8 don't have a specific, either direct or indirect reference back to the first 11 chapters of Genesis. Now, the third point I gave you there is no contradiction here. Remember to the fourth one. I said that all of the writers, and that's the important thing, all of the writers, all 8 of them refer. Philippians, that's by Paul. Thessalonians, Timothy, Titus, Philemon, all those are by Paul. But what about Romans and Corinthians and Galatians and all the other books that he wrote? Those do refer to creation. So it's no argument that we've got some books that don't refer as long as all the authors. That's the important thing, because at least they believed it. You might not say the same thing in every letter that you wrote to 6 people, but as long as you said it to one of them, we know that you believe it there. You don't have to say it in all 6 letters. Just say it in one of them, and we know that you believe it. And then 2nd and 3rd John. What about 1st John, the Gospel of John, Revelation? Got 3 other books that he wrote. Since they're not included here, obviously you can find a reference in the Gospel, in 1st John, in the book of Revelation, to the first 11 chapters of Genesis. Then fifthly, Jesus himself refers specifically to the first 7 chapters. And by the way, of course, the first 7 are the difficult ones. Jesus refers to the first 7 chapters of Genesis. Now, chapter 8 is about the flood, but so is 6 and 7, so it doesn't matter whether he refers to 8. Chapter 9 is all about Noah. We've already seen Noah all in chapters 6 and 7, so it doesn't matter about that. Chapter 10 is about the table of nations, and that is one chapter he doesn't refer to, but no one has nearly as much a problem with the table of nations as they do with creation, with the serpent talking, and with the flood. The table of nations is not the big thing. And then, of course, chapter 11 is the Tower of Babel, and then most of the chapter deals with the genealogy. And we do see the genealogy given, of course, over in the Gospels. We see a genealogy that would take us back, of course, in Luke's Gospel, all the way back to Adam. Now, Luke is a little bit different than Matthew because he at least appears to be going through Mary as opposed to Joseph, which is the keystone in Matthew's genealogy. Okay, in Mark 10 and verse 6, well, I'll go over and read these, I guess. Jesus is referring to Genesis 1, 26 and 27. But from the beginning of the creation, God made them male and female. Genesis 1, 26 and 27. Mark 10, verses 7 to 9. You have to just get these down where they correspond now. You'll have to be writing these down. Back to Genesis 2, 23 and 24. Now this is all, of course, accounts where Jesus himself is talking. John 8:44 refers back to Genesis 3, 1 to 5. Now that's an interesting text there, where Jesus said that you are of your father the devil. He was a murderer, a liar from the beginning, and he abode not in the truth. Now where in the world is he getting that analogy from? He's getting it from Genesis chapter 3, the first few verses there. The enemy didn't abide in the truth. He must have been in the truth at one time. You can't say that someone didn't abide there if they were there at one time. If they weren't there at one time. So he evidently was there, and we turn to chapter 3 of Genesis, and he's not abiding there. Luke 11:51. Back to Genesis 4, 1 to 8. Jesus is speaking in Luke 11 and in several other passages. that the blood of all the prophets from Abel to Zechariah the son of Berechiah would be required of this generation. So he's referring to Abel and his murder in chapter 4. Matthew 19:4 refers back to several places, but one of them it can refer back to is Genesis 5 and verse 2. Matthew 24:37 through 38 refers back to, I'll tell you what, let's read that one. Matthew 24:37 through 38. Because it's going to be different now from the next one that I give you. But as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered into the ark. Now think, what is this? The sixth time that I've given you that? So that would go back to chapter 6 then. Genesis 6, verses 1 through 5. We'll go back and read those. Now he's speaking of the days of Noah. He's talking about the characteristics of the days of Noah, that they would be duplicated in the days of the Son of Man. Where you've got eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage. And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them. Now this is one of your most difficult passages in the Scriptures, and I don't know if we're going to get to this in the creation class or not. We'll get to it sooner or later, because I've done a lot of study and thinking on this passage. There are various views, and we'll just say what we need to say when we get there. But don't make up your mind on these verses, because they are difficult. That the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. So we've got marriage, giving in marriage here. This is what he's referring to. The Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. So we've got the marrying and the giving in marriage, and obviously you've got eating and drinking at the same time. So that refers back to chapter 6. Then finally, Luke 17:27. Well, it's saying the same thing. We need to go on down here to the end of the verse, though. They were doing the marrying, the giving in marriage, eating and drinking, until the day that Noah entered into the ark, and the flood came and destroyed them all. Now, you see, the first part of the verse, just like there in Matthew, is going to be referring back to Genesis chapter 6. But we don't have any flood now in Genesis 6. No one being destroyed there. So the end of the verse of Luke 17:27 is referring back to Genesis 7, verses 10 through 23, where we have Noah entering the ark, and of course no one else being allowed with the exception of his household, and the waters covering the high hills and all the mountains, and then all flesh in which was the breath of life was destroyed. And so there you've got Jesus referring to chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. So evidently he believed in people like Adam and Abel and Noah and the serpent. He must have believed that these were literal occurrences here. Now there's an interesting verse I'd like you to see over in Psalm 119. In verse 160. He even believed in Noah's flood, because that's what he's basing the signs of the day of the Son of Man on, the same signs that we see during the days of Noah. Now you say, well, people have always been eating and drinking, and they've always been giving in marriage. Yes, that's true. But he's taking it a step further. That people are lazy today, eating and drinking. No hard workers left around. Too many modern conveniences for anyone to work. So you've got plenty of time to eat and drink. You've got plenty of time to marry, divorce, remarry, divorce, remarry, divorce, and remarry. And I think he's quite right in what he had to say. Now, do you really believe Genesis 1-11? I mean, does anyone here really believe what it says back there? Well, the psalmist said, "Thy word is true from the beginning." That's going to start with Genesis 1:1, which is where we are going to start right now. And he said that thy word is true from the very beginning. Notice he didn't say thy word is true starting with Genesis 12. Thy word is true from the beginning. 119, 160. The psalmist believed, Jesus believed, and some of us have the audacity to believe that Genesis 1-11 is true. And it's trustworthy. Let me go back to Genesis 1 now and give you an outline for creation, so that we can begin to break down each one of these days and look at each one of them and see what they have to say. On day 1, we have the unfinished heaven and earth. Now see, if you wouldn't have been here for the last, I don't know how many months, you wouldn't know what I meant by that statement. The unfinished heaven and earth and light, verses 1-5. I'm just amazed in reading people's writings, and they always talk about light, and this is always the implication if they don't say it. They always have in the back of their mind that light was the first thing created. And it's because they don't understand Genesis 1. They always think of light as being the first thing created. Notice I put the unfinished heaven and earth first, then light after that, verses 1-5. Now, I've already told you, at least with respect to man and the earth, we saw over in Proverbs, I think, chapter 8, what the first thing created was, and that was the highest part of the dust of the earth. It was dust. Now, we'll have to say more about that later, though. That's with respect to us, the first thing created, but there were things before that. Day 2, we have the creation of the expanse to divide the water. Verses 6, 7, and 8. Day 3, dry land and vegetation. Verses 9-13. Day 4, the luminaries. Verses 14-19. Day 5, fish and then fowl. Verses 20-23. Day 6, land animals and man. Verses 24-28. Now, if you just look at this general outline that I've given you, this is the general outline that we get here in the first chapter. There's just a whole lot of things that aren't mentioned here in this general outline, such as the insects, and what about all the stars, and what about all the other planets, and what about Lucifer, and what about the angels, and what about the demons and evil angels and evil spirits, good spirits, bad spirits? You notice they're not included here in this general outline. You say, well, then how are we going to find that out? You're only going to find that out from a diligent study of what's given us here in Genesis 1 and 2, as well as a few other places, to find out what was created when, and to be able to find out how you put it into this time scale of these first 6 days. Because I want you to realize now, nothing is created before day 1 and nothing is created after day 6. So we've only got days 1 through 6 to fit everything in on. Now for some people, just that one statement I made there would mess them up in their theology concerning when they think some things were created. Nothing was created before day 1, though. Some of you have frowns on your face. Nothing was created before day 1. I mean, that ought to be self-obvious there. Nothing is going to be made before day 1, or he would have called the day before that day 1. And day 1, day 2. And then nothing is created after day 6. So we've only got what the Bible calls and what we call today a work week here to work with. One work week to work with, to work in all the things that have been created in the past. So let's begin looking then at these days. We're going to start with day 1 this evening. And that is the first verse of Genesis. And that probably is about as far as we'll get if we get that far this evening. Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1. This is the most famous and important verse in all the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Now, I might ask all of you out there, if you had the opportunity to write the Bible, what's the first verse you would have written in the Bible? There's no greater thing, there's nothing better. You could never have thought anything better to say in the very first verse than this first verse and the tremendous amount of material that you're going to see this one verse contains here. The greatest verse in the Bible, the most important verse. As a matter of fact, if you'll turn over to Hebrews chapter 11, this is one of the greatest statements of faith that a person can ever even make. Oh, I believe that Jesus is Lord. Well, the devils believe that Jesus is Lord. Look in Hebrews, the faith chapter here. And he tells us in verse 2, he's going to talk about all the elders. Now, he doesn't mean church elders. He means the people of olden times, how they obtained a good report through faith. And by the way, the first one he starts with in verse 4 is Abel. So Hebrews and Paul in chapter 11 and the faith chapter, going back to the Genesis 4 account of Abel, offering a sacrifice. There's his brother Cain mentioned there. And now he being dead yet speaks, and he goes on to talk about Enoch, which would put us in chapter 5. He goes on to talk about Noah, which would put us in chapter 6. So Hebrews already, just parenthetically we might say, is already covering chapters 4, 5, and 6 of Genesis. But before it gets to talking about all of the elders and their exploits of faith, it starts off with Genesis 1:1. And that is Hebrews 11:3. And that's the greatest statement of faith in the Bible. I mean, if the whole chapter of faith begins with this verse, it must be an important verse. And if the whole Bible itself begins saying essentially the same thing, then that must make it an important verse. Through faith, we understand that the worlds were framed by the Word of God, so that things which are seen were not made of things which do appear. Now that is saying essentially what we've got in Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. We've got the Creator, we've got His action, and we've got the creation. Hebrews 11:3. Through faith we understand the worlds, that's the creation, were framed. That's His process by the Word of God. There's the Creator. All three, as we had all three in Genesis 1:1. So that the things which are seen were not made of things which do appear. I don't know of any better way to start out the Bible. Didn't start off talking about Jesus being the Son of God, in all due respect. Or that one day Jesus was going to hang on a cross and die for all mankind. Starts off with a statement that so many people stumble over. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. You see, it could have started with a simpler statement, that maybe so many people today wouldn't be stumbling over. They stumble right over that to verse 2, and then after they pervert that, and they stumble on to verse 3, and they're perverted the rest of their Christian life. I mean, you don't want to not understand what the Bible wants you to understand when it's making these statements in the very first page of what God is writing. Let me show you some verses that are interesting. Psalm 96 and verse 5. Because the rest of the Bible is always associating the Creator with His creation. And by the way, it's always, whenever you see God so many times, then it's going to mention creation right along with Him. Or whenever you see creation mentioned, then it's going to mention God right along with the creation. In other words, these two go together. God, the Creator, and the heavens and the earth, His creation. And as you'll see in a text here in Jeremiah, we're into a boiling pot if we separate the Creator and His creation by saying that perhaps evolution or perhaps a gap theory is what God is trying to say. Psalm 96 and 5, all the gods of the nations are idols, but the Lord made the heaven. In other words, the foundation for the statement that all the gods of the nations are idols is the fact that none of these idols or none of these gods could have made the heavens. That's his point. In other words, he's proving that God is the true God by the fact that He has created things and none of these idols could do that. Now just follow along. In chapter 115, we'll read these verses again. Verses 1 through 8, and then we'll go on down to a later verse. Not unto us, O Lord, not unto us, but unto Thy name give glory, for Thy mercy and for Thy truth's sake.
For the continued
Again. Verses 1 through 8, and then we'll go on down to a later verse. Not unto us, O Lord, not unto us, but unto Thy name give glory, for Thy mercy and for Thy truth's sake. Wherefore should the heathen say, where is now their God? But our God is in the heavens, and He hath done whatsoever He hath pleased. Their idols are silver and gold, the work of men's hands. They have mouths, but they speak not. Eyes have they, but they see not. They have ears, but they hear not. Noses have they, but they smell not. They have hands, but they handle not. Feet have they, but they walk not, neither speak they through their throat. In other words, they've got all the necessary parts of the body to somehow manifest something, whether it's verbally or whether it's physically, and yet they can't do anything. Not just with a voice, they can't move their fingers, they can't do anything at all. They that make them are like unto them, and so is every one that trusteth in them. Verse 15 now, you have to take this in context with the first 8 verses. Ye are blessed of the Lord, which made heaven and earth. Associating the Creator with His creation. In Jeremiah 10, verse 11, which happens to be the only verse in Jeremiah written in Aramaic. So it's an interesting verse for 2 reasons. One, it's not Hebrew. And 2, it has something to say about people's gods when they're not the Creator of the heaven and the earth. Now, if your God is not the one who made the heavens and the earth, or to say it another way, if your God is one who used evolution to make things, or if your God is the one who used the gap theory in billions of years to do things, I want to show you here what Jeremiah says about that type of God. Verse 11 of Jeremiah 10, Thus shall ye say unto them, The gods that have not made the heavens and the earth, even they shall perish from the earth and from under these heavens. He says if your God is not the one that made the heavens and the earth, then He's going to perish from the earth and from underneath these heavens that some true God somewhere did make. So those that are inventing some theory to explain how these things evolved into being, we've got a good text here to say that whatever God they're serving is not the everlasting God. He's going to have an end. And since we know that the God of the Bible is not going to have an end, it only proves that they're not serving the God of the Bible. Because the one of the Bible, this was a condition here, to be the God of the Bible, if you made the heavens and the earth. Because, see, none of us could do that. None of the pagan Gentile gods could do that. And neither could any of the idols of the heathen nations do that. Only the God of the Bible can create the heavens and the earth. Not by process of evolution and gap theory and day-age theory, but just the way he said that he did it. Let me read it again. Thus shall ye say unto them, the gods that have not made the heavens and the earth, even they shall perish from the earth and from under these heavens. I mean, it's not the type of God that you'd want to be serving, because he's not going to be the eternal one, the one that lasts forever. Back to Genesis 1 and verse 1. Now, when it makes a statement here, in the beginning, what does that mean? In the beginning of what? Because he doesn't say. He says, in the beginning, and then he says, now let me tell you what happened in the beginning. God created the heaven and the earth. Now, there are some people that take this to mean this is in the beginning of God. In other words, this is when God had his beginning. Now, where he came from, of course, we wouldn't know. How he got to be where he is, we wouldn't know if he had a beginning at some point. Even if he never had a beginning, we still wouldn't know anything about him. So it couldn't be referring to that. I mean, obviously, it couldn't be referring to in the beginning of God. It doesn't say that. It says in the beginning, and it's trying to locate something here, because then he wants to go on and say, in this beginning, then God created the heaven and the earth. Well, it's a fourfold beginning. First of all, it's in the beginning of matter. Now, you think about these things as we say them here, because they might go over your head. In the beginning of matter. There's been no such thing as what we call matter, which is made up of things like atoms, and I'm not going to break it down and name all the different things. We'll just call it all matter. There's been no such thing as matter before this. So when he says in the beginning, and we know we're getting matter right here, right away, and that's all in this same verse right here, then we know it's got to be in the beginning of matter. Secondly, in the beginning of space. We've never had space anywhere before. In other words, a place has never existed before this. Whether it's been occupied or unoccupied, whether it's filled space or empty space, space has never existed before this. In the beginning matter, in the beginning space. Thirdly, in the beginning of time. We never had any time before this. Now we see all three of these things thus far right here in the first verse. If we go back to the first thing, before we go on to cover the fourth one, in the beginning matter, well, we see the earth there. So there we've got the beginning. We go over to Proverbs 8, we find out the highest dust of the earth. There's matter. So we see this is what he's getting across here in the first verse. Secondly, in the beginning space, well, you had to have somewhere to put that earth, wouldn't you? Well, that's the heavens that he just created. So there's space. What about in the beginning time? Well, that's what the word beginning is. Anything before time couldn't have a beginning to it. Time is the only thing that could have a beginning to it. And as we'll see in another teaching here on these days, down on the fourth day, time is merely the measurement of change. Whenever you don't have change occurring anymore, then you no longer have time occurring anymore. And if there ever was a time when nothing ever changed, then that wasn't time. Time didn't exist then. Time is only the measurement of change. Now that ought to be obvious here, if nothing ever moved, never changed in this building, and see, that's impossible. There's just things floating around here in the building that you can't even see, time would not be here then. Because the only thing we need time for is as a measurement of change. From day 1 to day 2. How to get to church. Boil a 3-minute egg. Put your clothes on. Everything you do is change, and therefore it takes time. Now, since we've had nothing before this, and he's creating matter, then as soon as matter is created, at that instant, time begins. Because nothing of matter that ever changed had ever existed before this. You see, obviously, God's not made up of matter. John 4 and verse 24, God is spirit. They that worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. God is not matter. Man is matter. The earth is matter. Even the particles floating around out there in so-called empty space are matter. But if there was ever, see, I have to use the word time. If there ever was a time when we didn't have matter, then time wouldn't have existed. Because as soon as you've got matter, you're going to begin to change. Now, verse 14 of Genesis 1 is referring to the permanent luminaries in heaven that will serve as a guide to measure time on the earth, at least as long as they exist. But of course, that doesn't take place to the 4th day. I mean, sometimes in general you might say that time began here in verse 14 because there's the first time, there we go again, where you've got something to measure time by, something that at least that we have out there that we know of now. But if that's the 4th day, which verse 19 calls it, then we had to have a 3rd day. And that would push time back. We had to have a 2nd day, we had to have a 1st day, and then you say, now what about before that? We could have put in 1 day before that. No, you couldn't either. Because there's no such thing as a day in eternity. What about that song we sing? When we've been there 10,000 years, there are no years in eternity. You cannot be somewhere 10,000 years when you're in eternity. Unscriptural song there. We understand what we mean by it. A long time. What did I say, though? A long time. You can't spend a long time in eternity. Now, this is where God has been forever, and this is where he is right now. He's not involved in time. He made that little speck out in there in our universe called the sun, and this little speck called earth for our convenience, not for his. If you understand that, then there's no problem with Mark 11:24. As far as you're to be concerned, when you pray, believe that you have received. Doesn't matter how many times the earth rotates on its axis and revolves around the sun, has nothing to do with when God answered your prayer. He said, when you pray, believe that you receive it then. Now, he's the only one that has the authority to say things like that, dear friends, because he's the only one that lives outside of time. All the other things are involved in time because they are created. And if you're created, then you're involved in time right off the bat because you had a beginning. You have to be. Then fourthly, we said matter, space, and time. This is what he's talking about when he said the beginning of matter, the beginning of space, the beginning of time. And this fourth thing is really involved with the third thing, and that is time. But we have the beginning of events that God wants man to know about. Really three things, matter, space, and time. This fourth one you can tack on to time. Because if you've got time, you've got events. If you've got events, you've got time. We never had an event happen before this. No event had ever taken place before Genesis 1:1. Therefore, we've got the beginning of matter, the beginning of space, the beginning of time, and the beginning of events that God evidently must want us to know about, or he never would have started here and he never would have put this in his word. That, if you need a proof for the fact that we should and that God wants us to be able to understand Genesis 1 and 2 and 3 on through 11, that's enough of a proof there. This is the beginning of events. Now, why start with an event that it's impossible for man to understand in the first place? Or why start with an event and say, well, there's really no way that we'll ever grasp creation because, after all, Genesis 1 to 11 so mystical. If this is the one event that time began with, now see, we can't understand anything that began before time because no events took place then. I mean, how could you understand something that's not an event, that didn't happen? You couldn't understand something that's not an event, something that didn't happen. Something that would simply be beyond what a human being could understand or comprehend. But since he began with this event in this time, then he must mean for us to understand it. What you'll generally see this called, and this is true, the beginning that he's referring to is the absolute beginning. And they don't mean by that now the beginning of God, but the absolute beginning, which sums up the beginning of matter and the beginning of space and the beginning of time when you refer to the absolute beginning. Such as we see in several places. Mark 10 and verse 6. We'll look at Mark 13 and verse 19. For in those days shall be affliction, speaking of end time events, such as was not from the beginning of the creation which God created unto this time, and neither shall be. So the beginning of creation would be the creation of matter, space, and time. Ephesians 3 and verse 9. To make all see what is the fellowship of the mystery which from the beginning of the world hath been hid in God, who created all things by Jesus Christ. So he calls it here the beginning of the world. You remember there in Genesis 1, it doesn't say in the beginning of the world. It'd be easy to understand. It just says in the beginning, and then it states some things about that. And now you turn over to some of these New Testament passages, and the word beginning here is the same, and it's referring to the same event, but it follows it by saying from the beginning of the world. And right there you've got space, time, and matter all included. The world is the matter. It has to have space to occupy, and as soon as it comes into existence, it involves time right there. So he doesn't have to say in the beginning of space, time, and matter. He can simplify it by saying in the beginning of the world. And these other three things would have begun simultaneously. Romans 16:25. Now to him that is of power to establish you according to my gospel and the preaching of Jesus Christ, according to the revelation of the mystery which was kept secret since the world began, or since the beginning of the world. Hebrews 1:10. And thou, Lord, in the beginning. Now he's referring back to Genesis 1:1 insofar as he doesn't say the beginning of what here. He's got the in the beginning statement again. But he goes on to tell us the rest of Genesis 1:1 and what God did. Thou, Lord, in the beginning hast laid the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the works of thine hand. 2 Peter 3:4. Knowing this first, there shall come in the last days scoffers, walking after their own lusts, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation. Then 1 John 1 and verse 1. All of these New Testament writers have Genesis 1:1 in mind because they're all using the word beginning. That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon, and our hands have handled of the word of life. What do you think he's referring to there? Jesus, that which was from the beginning. It's an interesting text there, because if he says that which was from the beginning, and that would have to be the in the beginning, the very first words there of Genesis 1:1, it'd have to be that. And he goes on to say in Genesis 1 and verse 1 that God created, not the word of life here, but that God created the heavens and the earth. It would have to prove on the basis of 1 John 1:1 that he that was from the beginning was also from before the beginning also. That would have to follow. Since if he's there at the very beginning and he's not the first thing created, then he would also have to be the one from before the beginning, from before creation. Revelation 3:14. Now maybe this will make more sense to you. One of the false cults uses Revelation 3:14 to speak of the fact that Christ had a beginning at some time, and he was the first thing God created. And then our JDS foes say this text refers to Jesus being the first man to have a recreated spirit put in him. That's why I say this verse to the end. It's saying the same thing all the rest of the verses have said. It has nothing to do with either one of those things I just gave you. We use this in the JDS teaching. Unto the angel of the church of the Laodiceans write, these things saith the Amen, the faithful and true witness, speaking of Christ, the beginning of the creation of God. John is saying the same thing he said in 1 John 1 and verse 1. The one that was from the beginning of the creation of God. The one who was the Father of eternity, in other words. Isaiah 9 and verse 6 in the Hebrew. John chapter 1, the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verses 1 to 3. Of all these passages, this is the one that sounds most like the Genesis account. Now notice, I mean verbatim here, the first three words. Genesis 1:1, in the beginning. John 1:1, in the beginning. Must be referring to the same beginning, in other words. Not the beginning of God, though. In the beginning was the Word. Now this, in like manner as 1 John 1:1 would state, since he's not the first thing created, the heavens and the earth are the first thing mentioned there. It says, in the beginning was the Word, then not only would the Word be from the beginning, but he would be from before the beginning. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning. Twice he said it now. The absolute beginning is what we're talking about. With God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. Now going back to Genesis 1 and verse 1, we are introduced, secondly, to 5 things in Genesis 1 and verse 1. Every man, friends, just walking down the street or the path in Africa has to wonder about the beginning of all things. And I don't know who I would believe if I didn't believe the Bible. I mean, I don't know who there would be to believe if we couldn't believe the Bible here. So it's important that we understand what's going on here. We're introduced to 4 things. Man, the Christian, is introduced to 4 things. 5 things. 4 of these we've already mentioned. He's introduced to matter by means of the creation of the earth. He's introduced to space by means of the creation of the heavens. He's introduced to time by means of 2 things. 1, the usage of the word beginning. And secondly, change. We've got change here, so he's introduced time on the basis of change. Fourthly, he's introduced to events or occurrences. And then fifthly, and this is the greatest thing of all, man, finite man, when he goes back here, I'm talking about the biblical account when we read the Bible here. Fifthly, man is introduced to God. God is the number one word in the first verse of Genesis. And God, by the way, is the subject of the entire chapter. I think his name appears over 30 times just in Genesis 1. And to go beyond that, he's the subject of the entire Bible. Now, there are some basic assumptions that the Bible starts off with here with our first introduction of God. Now, you see, if we didn't have the Bible, then in the beginning, if there was ever such thing as a beginning, then who did what? We wouldn't know. So in the very first verse of the Bible, we're introduced to the master designer. In the beginning, God. And there's some basic assumptions that the Bible starts off here with in this very first verse. First of all, the Bible starts off, and you might have never thought of this, the Bible starts off with the assumption that God exists. Now, how about that? Notice he doesn't go into any detail here to try to prove that God exists. The Bible starts with the assumption. It's an assumption by faith. It's not demonstratable. It's not provable. It's not observable. Or you say, we can see the creation out there. Yeah, but do you see God anywhere out there? No. And did you see him do these things? No. How do we know he exists? Can you prove that he exists? The Bible, contrary to what a lot of people start off with, starts off with the assumption that he exists without offering any type of proof. Now, I want to prove to you that there is such thing as a God. Again, it's why it's such an important verse, because it's such a stumbling block for people. The Bible doesn't engage intellectual gears with anyone here. It just says, in the beginning, God. And the atheist says, well, how dare it just start off saying, in the beginning, God? There's no such thing as God. Prove to me that there's a God. And Moses and God, the one inspiring it, is not even concerned about that. He assumes that he exists, and he wants us to assume that he must exist. That's something that you have to assume by faith. Secondly, we're looking at some assumptions the Bible starts off with here about God. Secondly is the assumption of his plurality of being. The word God here is in the plural. I mean, in order to understand it from your English Bible, it would have to be in the beginning God, G-O-D-S, plural, created the heaven and the earth. Doesn't try to explain anything on what he means by that. And you see, the Hebrews had words singular that would do fine for God. But he chose a plural name for God. So it starts off with the assumption of his plurality of being. Now, you have to go a lot further beyond this, because you see the mystery and the doctrine of the Trinity is not taught in the Old Testament. It's there if you look hard enough, but it's not taught there. It is taught in the New Testament. It's not taught in the Old Testament, but it is there if you can see it. And it's fascinating to find the very first verse starts with the plurality of the being of God, and it assumes that this is true. Now, it doesn't say how many gods here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 12. But there is a plurality of being. Now, don't get confused. I'm not talking about a plurality of gods. I just said you had to put an S on there to understand it in the English. God. I said a plurality of beings, not a plurality of gods. Still one God, but he has a plurality of being, though. And the Bible starts with that. That's one of the major truths that we will study in theology. The Bible starts with that, and the fourth word of the Bible, of the English Bible, it starts with the assumption that God has a plurality of beings. Then thirdly, the assumption of a plural of majesty. And that, of course, is demonstrated in his plurality of being, insofar as it's a plural word used here. We have a plural word used for God, but we have a singular verb, which is something that you can't do. You can't have, even in the English, a plural subject and then match it with the wrong verb. You've got to have a verb that corresponds to the subject. But we've got God in the plural, and we've got create in the singular. That's teaching us two things there. We're just not going to get into that right now, though. Thirdly, I said a plural of majesty. This means that it's teaching the full possession of God of superhuman qualities, known in theology as the divine attributes of God. That's what the plural of majesty means. He possesses superhuman qualities. I mean, if anyone can make the heaven and the earth, obviously they're superhuman. So he possesses a plurality of being, a plurality of majesty, and then fourthly, and we said the plurality of majesty is known in theology as the divine attributes. Fourthly, another assumption that Genesis begins with is that this plural of being God may operate his divine attributes sovereignly. That is something that's assumed in verse 1. The doctrine of the sod is not taught as such in Genesis 1:1, but it is assumed. And we see it assumed insofar as God, with his superhuman qualities, was able to do what things soever he desired to do. Just the verse we read over there in Psalm 115, he hath done whatsoever he hath pleased. And that refers to his creation here. See, when you look deeper for these things, you don't have to find a verse that says God is sovereign. If you look deeper for these things, the first verse in the Bible teaches the sovereignty of God. If he, well, regardless of whether he's plural of being or not, if he has the plural of majesty, which means he has superhuman qualities, and we see him demonstrating these by not creating man and then asking man, now what should I do? But by starting off creating the heaven and the earth, then you've got the assumption there that the God that's doing all this is a sovereign God that can do what things soever he desires to do. And that's an assumption that the Bible starts off with here. Okay, now to go on here in the first verse. Well, I don't know. We don't really have time to go on here, do we? Praise the Lord. Well, I just mentioned this ahead of time, and then I guess we'll pick up next week. The word heaven here is in the plural, because the word heaven is always in the plural in the Bible. It's just that it doesn't always come across in our English version. So if the heaven is in the plural, but we don't see heaven made until down in verse 8, then what heavens, which heavens is he referring to? See, the heaven's not made until down in verse 8. But he says in verse 1, God created the heavens, plural, and the earth. Then we have to ask ourselves, well, which heaven did he make here? And how many are there? And along with that would come the question, when and where and how were the angels created? Since we know that they are created beings. Well, we'll just leave you with that to think about.
For a complete